Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Pod Save Chocolate. My name is Clay Gordon. I'm your host and your moderator today. I'm also the creator and the moderator of thechocolateLife.com. So, before we get into today's topic, which is about regenerative agriculture, what it means, is it the future of agriculture in cacao and other places? How are we going to put regenerative agriculture into a contextual framework? Right. Before we get into that, what I do want to let everybody know, number one, is go into the comments at the live chat on YouTube or into the comments on Facebook or LinkedIn, wherever you happen to be watching it. And I noticed that we had a little stutter on the start at LinkedIn. So we didn't actually go live until a few seconds later than we normally would. So welcome, everybody from LinkedIn. But go into the comments and let me know where in the world you are connecting from. So not YouTube, LinkedIn, or Facebook, but if you're in the United States, outside the United States, just give me a quick comment. Let me know where you are connecting from, right? And then if you have a question or a comment about anything that goes on during the course of the episode, please also put it in the comment. I will get it up on screen and we will get the questions asked. And hopefully what we'll do is we'll get them answered. And if we can't get them answered during the episode, what I will do is I will go answer them and put them in the comments to today's post. And with that, what I want to do is I want to share. This is the homepage of the Chocolate Life right now. You can go there. All of these links are live. And for every single episode of Pod Save Chocolate, I put together a post. And this post gives an overview of what the episode is about, as well as links and resources and references that you can refer to. If you have two screens, you can follow along. But if you don't have two screens, what you can do is you can stop afterwards, and you can go and refer to everything. And this way, you don't have to follow along with the links during the episode. You'll be able to go, and I will link to everything so that you'll be able to review after the fact and get all the information that you need. And on this page are also the links to watch this afterwards here on YouTube and here on LinkedIn and here on Facebook on my profile there. And before we jump into today's topic, what I all want to say is that before we get into it, that's a little redundant because I think I just said that. I want to thank everybody who is a member of the Chocolate Life, because this episode, like every episode of Pod Save Chocolate, is supported and sponsored by the members of the Chocolate Life. And with all that, let's get going on today's topic, regenerative agriculture. And there are a couple of ways of thinking about how to approach the topic. And one of them is to start off with some definitions. So when we're talking about regenerative agriculture, what is it that we mean? And it's important to understand, all right, that there are some important and subtle differences when it comes to different definitions of what regenerative agriculture means. And so what I did is I used a tool. I used a browser called Arc, and part of Arc now is that I can set a default search engine to one called Perplexity. And Perplexity uses an AI backend to be able to go look across and generate summaries, as well as provide links. And so I use Perplexity AI for some of my searches, and Google for others, and DuckDuckGo for a third. So I try to spread that around. But the sort of summary of regenerative agriculture that Perplexity put together for me in the process of putting together was the term regenerative agriculture has been defined in various ways by different sources, which, as I just said, but generally refers to a system of farming principles and practices that increase biodiversity, enrich soil, improve watersheds, and enhance ecosystem services. While there are competing definitions, which I mentioned, the core focus remains on improving soil health and promoting sustainable land management practices. So great. I mean, we have an idea. This is what a general definition of what regenerative agriculture means. So to some extent, when we think about regenerative, I think, right, what we're talking about is moving from a system which is going to degrade the soil, right, and the supporting ecosystems and the dependent ecosystems, right, to a system which is going to make sure that the supporting ecosystems, the dependent ecosystems, and the crop, whatever it is going to be managed in a way so that the soil is not depleted, so that the water is used responsibly, and other resources are used responsibly. That's I think a pretty good definition for what I would think when people are talking about regenerative agriculture. I wanted to point out, if I can, that this definition that Perplexity put together was pulled from another sources, one of which is the Natural Resources Defense Council. It also came from an organization called Regeneration International, or Regeneration International. And so those two are the primary sources. I also linked to the definition of regenerative agriculture at Wikipedia. And so what I suggest that you all do is go take a look at the summary which was generated, and then go to all these other places and figure out for yourselves what you think regenerative means. And so particularly what I want to do is I want to contrast this notion of regenerative agriculture with a term called agroforestry. So agroforestry, I did the same thing. I went to Perplexity. What is agroforestry? So it's a multifunctional system that provides a range of social and environmental benefits, and it's crucial to smallholder farmers. That's what it is that it says here, and other rural people, because it can enhance their income and health, right? So by integrating trees on farm and in the agricultural landscape, agroforestry diversifies and sustains production. So when we think about agroforestry in the context of cacao farming, what it generally means is that the cacao trees are not the only trees that are planted on the farm. Now, this shouldn't come as much surprise to people who've spent some time on the farm. And the reason why that is because when cacao trees have been taken out of the nursery and they've been planted in the farm, one of the first things we're going to do is we're going to provide some shade crops. Shade crops, often bananas, and so the cacao trees are grown under banana, right? And which provides shade for the young trees, because when the trees are young, they are susceptible to getting too much sun and drying out, and the leaves getting burned, right? And another really important aspect of agroforestry or planting bananas, right, in small cacao farms, is that the trees are not going to become productive for a couple of years. And so if you're going to be planting new farmland, the farmland needs to start generating income right before 3-5 years in the future. And if you plant bananas and other crops, then what you can do is you can use the bananas and other crops as income while you're waiting for the cacao to start producing. So as the cacao trees get older, you can chop down the banana trees. You can cut up the banana trees. So because the sliced up stalks are very, very good at holding moisture, and that moisture is good for ensuring strong colonies of pollinating insects, for example, right? So you want to leave it in there, and then the stalks will decompose into the ground, and they will provide organic matter, right? And so we can think about agroforestry in that very, very narrow sense. That for some reason there's a focus on other trees, right? But is that the right place to go? So when in a previous episode of Pod Save Chocolate, and you can go here. So there's the calendar and archive. You can go look at previous episodes. We did an episode in January. So it was episode 13, which is about adding value in cocoa producing countries. And so one thing we might do when we might think about agroforestry is to think about what are those additional crops that we might plant within a cacao farm, which are complementary to cacao as a crop. So, for example, there have been a lot of experiments in Costa Rica and other places about using cacao trees as tutors for vanilla. It doesn't work any place, and there's some people who are saying, yeah, but it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to do that. But certainly the idea of planting vanilla within the context of a cacao plantation is adding value directly, because vanilla is a product which is very, very complementary to chocolate. But what we might also do, in addition to bananas and other plants, number one is certainly having trees, which are hardwoods, which are tropical hardwoods, so teak and mahogany, which have very, very long life cycles. So you're going to harvest them in 10 years, 20 years, and 30 years. Those are things we might use for shade and windbreak. We might see, could I plant other fruit trees, nuts, other things which are going to give the farmer a cash crop and could be complementary to what it is that, to derivative products which can be made from cacao, perhaps on the farm or in the local community. And so thinking about agroforestry, not just in terms of trees, but in terms of other crops, many of which might be food crops, I think is really, really important to do so. That, regenerative agriculture, how is regenerative agriculture different from agroforestry? Are regenerative agriculture and agroforestry maybe the same things, or could they be used to the same ends? And this is, I think, a question that becomes really, really challenging for a lot of people, because these definitions, the differences in the definitions, tend to separate us rather than unite us. So some people are out there promoting agroforestry, some people are out there promoting regenerative agriculture. Can I do regenerative agriculture in an agroforestry system? Are they complementary? I mean, it all comes together. I personally think that they are not mutually exclusive, that they are related, that I can engage in agroforestry and not necessarily be observant to regenerative agricultural practices. So we need to be very, very careful. And people who know me and have followed me for some time know that I think I personally think that the words we use inform our beliefs inform our actions, and our actions have consequences. And so it's very, very careful to understand that. I also want to point out that this idea is not new, right? That people who are talking about agroforestry is the future of agriculture, or regenerative agriculture is the future of agriculture. We need to go back and recognize that prior to the arrival of Europeans in the Americas, and I'm saying, is this also prior to the arrival of Norse people? So, for example, the Vikings. I don't know how old this is, example, but there is this concept in Mesoamerica. I believe it's originally from Mesoamerica, and I think it was it spread throughout the Americas, right? Of the notion of what's called a milpa, right? And so a milpa, the definition is here. I took it from. I forget where I got it from. But a milpa is a field, usually but not always recently cleared, often cleared by fire, but not always, in which farmers plant a mix of crops at the same time. And this mix of crops might include maize or corn, avocado, multiple varieties of squash beans, melons, tomatoes, chilies, sweet potato, jicama, amaranth, mucuna, which I'm not familiar with. And maybe I'll put a link to mucuna so we can find out what that is. But what you'll notice there is that these are all food crops, right? These are all food crops. So I'm not sure why. I'm sorry. These are all food crops. And there are different kinds of food crops. Some of these might be nitrogen fixing, and some of them, are going to be used to, not only feed me, but to enrich the soil. And there is a sense in which there is a fallow period. So you might plant this for a couple of years. It would go fallow for a couple of years. You plant again for a couple of years. But the research has shown that milpa-style farming is incredibly effective in terms of maintaining the health of the soil and incorporating carbon and other materials, organic materials, into the soil over very, very long periods of time. And it is possible to combine some of these crops with cacao, right? And that is something that has been shown, I believe, in Ecuador, that there are places up in the Andes, up in the hills, up in the mountains, where this milpa is done in conjunction with cacao farms, so that there are items which can be consumed by the farmer and their family, items which can be traded, and items for other things, items which can be sold into the local economy, providing a huge a huge benefit, not only economically to the farmer, but nutritionally to the farmer. And actually, this quote comes from one of my favorite books on this topic and related topics. A guy by the name of Charles Mann wrote a book called 1491, New Revelations of the Americas Before Columbus. And this book talks about, what the Americas were like before the arrival of the Europeans, Columbus and his ilk. And the first chapter, which I think is really, really interesting as well, and specifically interesting for me, and this is the context in which I learned about it, talks about the human habitation of the Itenes region, which is in the Beni in Bolivia. And it talks about the creation of these little islands called chocolatales, which sit above the savanna, and things were grown on these chocolatales. And so human habitation, which stretches back a long time before the arrival of the Europeans, and in many ways was incredibly sophisticated. And that's where one of the things that Mann says is, he quotes the milpa in the estimation of Garrison Wilkes, who's a maize researcher, a corn researcher at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, says the milpa is one of the most successful human inventions ever created, to which I would have to agree, right? That in terms of sustaining, right, a community of people over a long period of time, nutritionally and economically, the milpa has been incredibly successful, right? And it is the opposite of monoculture, right? Growing. So here is a deliberate choice to, in the same general location, produce to plant all of these different crops, each of which is able to provide a different economic and nutritional component into the lives of the local community, and not just the soil. So we're not talking just about the soil here, and I think that's one of the things that is for me missing about. So while it is important to make sure that the health of the soil is maintained, while it is important to ensure that water resources are managed easily, managed. We don't want to overuse water. We want to make sure that we're using enough water to make sure that the plants grow. But we want to make sure that we're not overusing the water. It's really, really important to understand the purpose of agriculture. And the purpose of agriculture is to grow food for people to eat, or grow food to feed animals, which are eventually going to feed us. And that the milpa, and I would say that I would like to throw fermentation as another one of the most successful and one of the most important human inventions ever. And when it comes specifically to Mesoamerica, the idea with the process of nixtamalization. So nixtamalization is the processing of corn, maize, with lime in a way that makes the protein in the corn more bioavailable. And by doing so, the nixtamalization enabled a very few people to create enough food to support a vastly larger population than in the past. And in some respects, nixtamalization has been credited with being one of the reasons why Mesoamerican cultures were able to grow as large. I mean, to be able to support the populations that they were able to do. But stepping back a little bit, this notion of agroforestry, this notion of regenerative agriculture, right, is one that has existed for many, many hundreds of years, if not significantly longer. So the notion of regenerative agriculture is not necessarily a new one. And the notion of agroforestry is not necessarily a new one. And we need to keep that in mind when we start thinking about planting, right? And the kind of planting system that we're going to use, and what is the purpose of why we're planting what it is that we're planting. And so what I want to do is step back a little bit, and when we and to put the word regenerative into a sort of larger philosophical, political, economic sort of context, and think about whether or not there is another way to think about this, or perhaps another word that we might be able to use in order to be able to wrap our minds around what we're doing. But before I do that, what I want to do is I want to point to a couple of pictures here. All right, right. And these are two pictures which are in the body of the post. And if you can go into the comments, I'll just ask the question. Go into the comments, let me know what you think. Is this photograph, does it represent an actual instance of what might be thought of as regenerative agriculture, right? So this is open sun cacao farming in the Guayas region of Ecuador, right? So is this an example of regenerative farming? And is this an example of regenerative farming? And these are the same day, believe it or not, just different times of day. So that's what we saw. But would we think that this is better than this, right? So is this better than this? Is either of them regenerative farming? We might say, is it agroforestry? I mean, what is going on here, right? In these particular cases, that would say, no, it's not regenerative farming, or yes, it is regenerative farming. And so I'm gonna go on for a minute or two, and I will give everybody who's watching a time, if they want to go into the comments. And I'm also going to add a third image. So this photograph that's behind here, does this represent an example of regenerative farming? So this is cacao farming. Again, it's in the Guayas region of Ecuador. I was there in October of 2022, right? And so got a chance to see this firsthand. These are images that I took while I was there. So yeah, is this an example of regenerative farming, right? Let me know, is this an example of regenerative farming? Is this an example? Is any one of them better than any of the others? Let me know in the comments, YouTube, live chat, LinkedIn, Facebook. Let me know what it is that's going on. And I'll come back in a minute and I'll try to answer that question for you. Before we do, what I want to do is I want to suggest that one of the challenges that we are currently facing, in the world of regenerative agriculture, and when I say we, I'm talking about the global we, the royal we, when we were facing, is around the question of certification, right? So if we have a regenerative agriculture certification, what does that mean, right? And so what I've done is, again, here's a summary, which was generated by Perplexity. And then I have links to I didn't mean to click on that, 1, 2, 3 different certification programs, right, in regenerative agriculture. And so one is Regenerative Organic Alliance. So one is the Rodale Institute, and the third one is something called the Greener World. So we have 3 different certifications in here. And so we need to ask ourselves, okay, what are the differences between these regenerative certifications? Are they in fact measuring the same things? So I'm going to assume that, right, I'm not going to assume. For each one of these certification programs, there is a checklist of things that need to be adhered to. So some certifying body is going to come to your farm or farms. They're going to look at your practices and say, did you do X? Did you do Y? Did you do Z? Are you doing the following 11 things? Yes or no? And then according to some rubric that we've created, we're going to give you this little symbol that says you are in fact certified regenerative, right? And one of the interesting challenges here is that one of these organizations is called the Regenerative Organic Alliance and Regenerative Organic Certified. And so to what extent does regenerative certification and organic certification overlap, right? And for example, would the USDA NOP label be something that this regenerative organic certification mean that I would be able to put on my label? Would it be BioSwiss accepted so that I would be, certified organic in the EU, not just in the United States? But One of the challenges that is associated with certifications in general, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many people that I've spoken with, is they tend to be one size fits all certifications. And that's done because it's easier for the certifying body to be able to go in with their checklist and go, yes, yes, no, no, yes, yes, no. And it's easier. So, um, so if you're doing a regenerative or any kind of certification, and you're doing it in Colombia, or you're doing it in Peru, and you're doing it in Madagascar, what you're doing is you're asking yourself, are the same processes being observed in all these places? When it comes to Rainforest Alliance, are the same processes being observed? When you're doing fair trade certification, are the same processes being observed? Yes and no. And so there's a one size fits all mentality. And when you're talking about a social certification, where what really matters to you is, how the people are treated on the farm, maybe that works better than others, better than another approach. But in reality, there is this challenge which says that I am the certification organization is imposing a set of values, right? So we, the certifying organization, have a set of values, and we want you, the farming organization, to adopt our values and prove to us that you've adopted our values, and we're going to measure you on this little checklist, right? And what that does is it ignores the fact that there might be cultural differences in certain parts, for example, of West African tribal culture, where some of the things that we think are really important are not at all important there, or are already taken care of in a different way, and don't lend themselves necessarily to checking off a box. That this one size fits all approach might not work in a social certification. Maybe it works better in an organic certification. But one of the challenges with regenerative agriculture certification is that it focuses on agricultural practices. And one of the potential problems with this is that the agricultural processes, the agricultural methods and processes, which are appropriate, right, for harvesting, for planting, maintaining, and harvesting cacao in a coastal plain, might be very, very different from those required in mountainous areas. And so if there is a one size fits all approach, I don't necessarily, from what it is that I've seen of these checklists, that there is enough fungibility and fluidity and flexibility to ensure that that we can in fact encompass all of the methods and practices which are important to be able to assure the goals of soil health, biodiversity, water quality, and social fairness, right? And also things like animal welfare, right? So these are really, really interesting challenges, which I don't think necessarily lend themselves to a one size fits all approach. And so I am, especially when we have, here's one approach to regenerative certification, regenerative ag certification, and here's another approach to regenerative ag certification, and here's a third approach to regenerative ag certification. How do we as consumers know what is actually being measured? So I go into a store, I see a symbol, it's on a package. I'm going to use that symbol as a proxy for decision making, because if it's been certified, it must be good, right? But for those of us who followed social certifications, perhaps like Rainforest Alliance, perhaps like Fair Trade, it's not necessarily the case that what these people say they're delivering to the farmers actually what they're delivering. In general, there's a lot more responsibility for reporting up from the farm, right, through the middlemen to the processor to the consumer. There's a lot more responsibility for reporting up the chain, and there's almost no concomitant responsibility for reporting back down the chain. And so we as consumers don't actually know that the people who are doing the certification are being held to account, that what they say they're delivering, they're actually delivering. And so I would be very, very careful with any one certification, and when there are competing certifications, right? And I think there's going to be a proliferation of competing certifications. We've got 3 here. There are going to be many, many more. In the future, this is going to be a problem that's going to take a long time to solve, right? So we have to agree on a definition of what regenerative agriculture means. We have to agree, I think, that regenerative agriculture practices might mean different things in different places, that there might be many, many different ways of achieving the same results, right? And so what will happen is that each one of these certifications might have a different focus, right, on a different method of achieving specific results. And so they're all measuring different things. And so we don't know what the meaning of what regenerative means is diluted. A challenge. Before I jump into the next thing is good morning to Mark and Yuri from Blue Spruce Chocolates in Kittredge, Colorado. You slammed with Valentine's order. Hey, Mark, it beats the alternative. If, the week before Thanksgiving or Valentine's Day, if you weren't slammed with orders, that's a very, very different set of challenges that you need to worry about. So I'm glad to hear that you're busy, and I'm glad to hear that you're listening in this morning. And what's that? Was that an eye test? Again, so what I'm going to go is I'm going to go back to here, and so and show the images that I did earlier. Right. So this is an example of open sun farming, right? High intensity open sun farming. So this is in Ecuador. These are fine and flavor cacao variety. These are Nacional varieties that are being grown in open sun in straight rows, right? And the question is, how can this be regenerative? How can this possibly be regenerative? And then this one, right, looks like it might be more regenerative. So what we have to do, right, Mark, I have the great question, so thanks for asking them, and I'll get to it, is we need to determine what the goals are for regenerative farming. What are the goals of regenerative farming? And the goals of regenerative farming are basically improve soil health, right? Or especially not degrade soil health, but we want to improve soil health. We want to do better at water management, right? And part of improving soil health is going to be about sequestering organic matter and carbon into the soil in forms that the trees can use, right? So that's what it's all about. And so in this particular case, it's high intensity, open sun farming, and it's being drip irrigated. And in the irrigation water, you can apply to the root system, right, nutrition, right, that the tree needs, right? So there is a difference between nutrition, which you put in the root systems, and things that you spray on leaves, the foliar spray. But what you do is if you look at the results of this, so number one, we're reducing the amount of water that is being used. Number two, we were reducing the amount of chemicals that are being used. And these may be organic nutritional supplements, right? But we are reducing the cost of fertilization. We're reducing the amount of water that's being used, right? And number three, if you actually go take a look over the course of 5 years on this particular farm, what they've done is they've more than quadrupled the organic content matter of the soil. Right? And this used to be it was a dry forest. All the trees, the original trees that were here, were cut down to build boats and to build houses in the city of Guayaquil. And so it's a diverse, but it's a second generation, third generation forest. Right now, the irrigation water comes from a hydroelectric plant, which is further up north. But there is a canal which runs right by this farm. And so if you take a look at all of the measures of what regenerative agriculture is supposed to achieve, right, in terms of soil health, water management, and things like that, this farm achieves those goals. It also has the goal of increasing soil health, right, and by improving the organic matter content of the soil, which reduces the amount of supplemental fertilization that is required. And this has been done over a relatively short period of time, right? What it also has done, and I think this is something that tends to be overlooked in the conversation about regenerative agriculture, is productivity. So these are nacional varieties. So they are fine and flavor cocoa varieties, which are not necessarily known for their productivity. And in Ecuador, the average production on a farm like this might be 600 kilograms dry per hectare, right? But this particular method of planting results in a productivity of closer to 2 metric tons per hectare, which means we're producing 3 times as much cocoa. So we're generating 3 times as much income on the same amount of land, right? While reducing the amount of water that we're using, and we're reducing the cost of fertilization. And it turns out that the planting density, so if you were to go here and you're to look at this, this is a triangular planting design. It's about 1,100 trees per hectare. If you come in here, I think it's a little over 1,200 trees per hectare. So it's not many more trees, right? It's just a lot more. It's a very, very different approach to planting. So one of the things you may not notice here, something that I noticed, is that these rows are organized with respect to the plot of the sun. So a heliostat of the sun, right? How it goes over the sky. And so the rows are planted far enough apart that the sun can get between the rows and shine on one side of the plant in the morning, or one row of trees on one side in the morning and the other side of that row of trees in the afternoon. And so there is a lot more sun in here. It also has the advantage of taking into an account perhaps prevailing winds, reducing humidity, and that reduced humidity will result in lower fungal diseases. Whether they will take root or whether they will spread. So there are lots of. I mean, if you take a thought about the objectives of what it is that we want to do with regenerative agriculture, this counts. However, it is completely at odds with our notion of what should an agroforestry system. So this is not agroforestry. I mean, there are no other trees here. All right, there's minimal shade. The shade you can't see. It's windbreaks which divide one plot from another plot. This is also small scale monoculture. So you might have a couple of hectares of the same plant, and right next to it, you might have a couple hectares of a different variety, and then next to that, a couple of hectares of a different variety. So these are, in fact, monocultures within plots, but they're not very, very large scale monocultures. Now, this is a different plot on the same farm. And so one of the things that's being done here, and so this is the Hacienda Victoria. One of the things that's being done here is that the owners are experimenting with different planting designs, right, and different approaches to different aspects of, right, the way they grow their plants. And so here, what they're doing is number one is that their pruning schedule is very, very different from that which is recommended by most best practices manuals when it comes to pruning. They prune far more often than is recommended. So instead of doing twice a year, I think they're doing 4 times a year. And as you can see, they're leaving all of that organic matter, or the vast majority of the organic matter, in the farm in order for it to decompose and be incorporated into the soil. But one of the things that the research discovered here is that when you have new leaves, so what are called flushing leaves, so they're new leaves that are growing, they're actually absorbing more CO2 from the atmosphere than older, more mature, drier leaves. And so if you prune on a more often basis in a way that gives you more flushing leaves, then the trees are more efficient at pulling out atmospheric carbon dioxide and moving it into the soil. I mean, either directly through the root system or through the materials that are decomposing on the ground. So, interesting kind of idea. Now, I can tell you also that one of the things that's being done here on the Hacienda Victoria is they've got a very sophisticated method of understanding whether they are underwatering or overwatering, and whether or not they are delivering or over delivering the nutrition that's in their drip irrigation. So this is not inexpensive. It's 8 to 10 times the cost of hectare in terms of infrastructure, just clearing the land, as opposed to providing the drip irrigation, right? So it's relatively expensive. But again, they're reducing water usage, they're reducing the cost of agricultural inputs, and they're tripling the productivity on the same amount of land. And so Mark, if I was at a different time of year closer to when these were being pruned, you'd see a lot more leaf litter on the ground, right? Than here, and that you see here, because I'm literally going in and the crews are pruning this land. They were pruning the land on the day that the trees on the day that I was there. They were on this plot, and so one of the things which is interesting about this is that this farm has also received a certification for being carbon neutral. So that if you were to do measurements of all of the different activities that are on the farm, what they're saying is they're sequestering more carbon into the soil than they're releasing, right? Which is, a benefit. So it may not be considered to be part of regenerative agricultural directly, right? But it is an important thing that the organic matter is being incorporated into the soil. It's improving the diversity of the microbiome in the soil. So the bacteria and other microorganisms that are living in the soil. The trees are healthier, they're more productive, they're doing a better job of decomposing this material, getting into the soil faster. It's really, really an interesting thought about how our perceptions, right? So we look at this and we go, how can it possibly be regenerative, right? All right, maybe there's not a whole lot of diversity of trees here, so maybe it's not agroforestry. There is no milpa. There are no other crops which are being planted here, right? And so it might be a thought that what we could do is we might intercrop. So I might have some shade cover, which might be between the rows, which might be a nitrogen fixing plant, so something leguminous, which could also produce a food crop that I might be able to use. I could That's something to be used. I could put more trees up in terms of windbreaks, right, and to delineate different areas of the farm. But what I wanted to do by showing you these two photos in particular, right, is that what regenerative agriculture looks like, what agroforestry looks like, may be very, very different from what you think it should look like, right? And this is one of the challenges I have with certifications, is that what we need to do is we need to go and look at, are we achieving end results rather than what is the method of achieving them, which I think is a challenge in certification programs, because it tends to talk a lot about methodology, not just results. Now, having said all that, what I want to do is I also want to go back to this picture. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the original of this picture, I'm going to put it into the gallery below so you can go take a look at it, right? And so this is another example of a different planting style, which is within a couple hundred meters of the open sun one that I showed you. So it's in a different part of the farm, but it's very, very close by. What you've got here is a bunch of hillocks, right, with troughs in between them. They're about 2 meters apart, center to center, maybe a little closer than that. But the trees, if it'll be more obvious in the picture that I post, but the trees are actually aligned so that there are 3 main branches, and they're all in the same plane, right? And the trees are held up by wires, right? So this looks a lot like a vineyard. And instead of grapevines, what they're doing is they're planting cacao trees. Now, these are all obvious. It's not obvious, but it is in photos. These are drip irrigated, right? And the furrows between the hillocks, right, is where a lot of the organic matter that is pruned off the trees goes, and they're deep and they hold water more efficiently, right? But again, what you can't see here, but is obvious from the open sun, the other open sun photos, is that this row is oriented towards the path of the sun. And so in the morning, perhaps, this side gets full sun, in the afternoon, the other side gets full sun. And this is a good thing. Now, also the trees are very narrow and they're put together, so they're very, so this makes it really easy to be able to reach in and harvest the pods off the trees, which is a great thing. I mean, it's and they're also topped. So I think they're at like 7 feet, maybe the highest that these things go, um, in terms of how high the trees are allowed to grow. And so these are organized in a way that makes it very easy to harvest them. Right now, they're also organized in a way that increases productivity. Right. So again, you know, 2 metric tons per hectare of a fine flavor variety as opposed to 600 kilos is a lot. A difference in productivity, it means that I could produce twice the amount of productivity on 2/3 of the land, right? Oh, if I can do that, I can use another third, the land that's no longer planted in cacao, for a more traditional milpa, for a more traditional agroforestry system, for planting other complementary crops on the farm. So I think when we think about the term production and productivity, we need to think about how much cacao am I currently producing per land area, and if I were able to produce the same amount of cocoa on a third of the land, what would have with less effort? So there's less labor involved, less water involved, fewer agricultural inputs involved. So it would cost less in that respect, right? Would it make sense to, for example, reduce the amount of land that I'm planting by half, produce 50% more than I'm currently producing on the land that I've got in production, right? And then be able to use the rest of the land to do things like, oh, I could have biodiversity corridors, which will allow birds and insects and animals to move from one part of the landscape to another part of the landscape. Could I use it for crops, so additional crops? So could I be planting food crops, corn, legumes, other things like that? I mean, there are lots of ways of thinking about how this works. And I wanted to be able to really point out just how different these kinds of systems are. Now, this is considered by one of the people who founded one of the regenerative agricultural certifications to be regenerative. And he was really, really surprised that regenerative agriculture in cocoa could look like that. And he was flabbergasted when he heard the statistics. 1/3 less water, 50% of the water, 1/3 fewer agricultural inputs, increased productivity, reduced labor costs. I mean, increasing the organic matter in the soil. All of those things are, in fact, right, what we're looking for regenerative agriculture to do for us, right? And what we're looking for, right, agroforestry to do for us. What we want the milpa to do for us can be done these ways. And in fact, it might look really, really different from what you're expecting, right? And I think that's, if there's one thing that I wanted to make sure that um, I highlighted today, I think that's it, right? That, you know, that whether we call it agroforestry, whether we call it regenerative, whether we call it something else, it doesn't have to look a specific way, right? And it needs to adapt to local environmental conditions, local social conditions. I mean, it needs to be flexible enough to be able to fit within, the differences in agriculture, farming, and other practices in Ecuador, then Peru, then Bolivia, then the mountains of Colombia or the coastal plains of Colombia. It needs to be that flexible. And we also need to understand that there is a role for the estate holder farmer, right? And where the farmers are hired labor, and the smallholder farmer, right? Is the future of regenerative agriculture smallholder farming? Maybe, maybe not, right? What are the advantages of keeping the smallholder farmer on the smallholder farm? Might there be advantages in terms of some form of organization, which is different from a cooperative, right? As we think about cooperatives today, that would enable the farmers to share labor, pool resources, and be more efficient, right? And be more productive. And I think that's another part of the conversation that is missed a lot in regenerative agriculture. Right? And so, in the last couple of minutes, what I want to do is I want to talk about sort of this political, theoretical, economic sort of framework. And so, what I want to do is I want to say, when we think about regenerative agriculture, what is regenerative agriculture compared with what? Regenerative compared with what? Right? And what I think we want to do is we want to recognize that the agricultural, economic, and political systems that seem to dominate in most of the quote unquote Western world um, are in fact what could be called extractive, right? And so we have extractive agricultural system. And what that extractive agricultural systems is, how do I get the most value out of the land at the least cost, right? And so the goal of farming is to just get as much as I possibly can. And that could be extractive farming, it could be extractive mining, it could be extractive many, many things, but it is extractive. And one of the tools of extractive agriculture is that the people who are involved in it are looking to be able to move off their balance sheets a lot of the risks associated with it. So if there's erosion, if there is a problem with using a toxic fertilizer, if or any kind of practice which causes the land to deteriorate over time, reduces local water quality, might have an impact on wildlife. Extractive agricultural practices, the companies that engage in it, have almost a fiduciary responsibility to push those risks, to push those costs onto other people, and to remove them from their balance sheet as far to the extent that they can, right? And so the extractive agriculture, all right, fits within this context of extractive economics. So when we think about the purpose of a corporation, the purpose of a C corporation specifically, is it's designed to maximize return to investors and shareholders, right? And that is, if you are the CEO, you're a member of the board of one of these companies, and you are not doing everything you possibly can to maximize return, then you can be booted out of office. Right? And so there is a sort of perverse incentive to be able to move risk and to externalize costs, to move them off the balance sheet. And this is why we find, the indigenous peoples in the middle of the Ecuadorian Amazon are having to deal with all of the costs associated with the exploitation of their lands for petroleum exploration, right? Because the petroleum companies have just said, it's not our responsibility, right, to take care of these costs. It's our job to extract the maximum value from what we're doing. And so we have this extractive agricultural system which exists within this context of an extractive economic system. And this extractive economic system exists within the context of what I think of as extractive politics, right? So we have a political system, right? And not just in the United States, but in many places around the world, where the goal seems to be to separate people who can't afford to give up the resources that they have and transfer those resources up to people who really don't need them. And is this anti-libertarian? Maybe, right? But there's a sort of equitability and there's sort of fairness associated with, okay, right? So if how it's how are these companies, how are these political entities managing the risks and managing the damage that they're doing? And the answer is they're not. Right? What they're doing is they're externalizing. They're pushing off to future generations, to other entities, right? The consequences of what they're doing. They're not recognizing the risks and costs on their balance sheet. And so this might be one way of thinking about regenerative. So I have regenerative agriculture, which is talking about, healthy soil and healthy water and healthy ecosystems and biodiversity and supporting local communities. I think the notion of this has to be smallholder farmers, not one that if we are limiting it to smallholder farmers, I think we're doing a disservice to these ideas. But the idea being is that so if we have a regenerative agricultural system, what would a regenerative economic system look like? Because we can't get to regenerative agriculture on a widespread basis until it exists within an economic system that understands, rewards, values it, right? And so in order to get to regenerative agriculture, we need to get to a regenerative economic system, which needs to be supported by a regenerative political system. And that regenerative political system, again, it may seem more anti-libertarian, it may seem more socialist. I don't think it fits into the definition, the epithet of socialism, right, that is currently being thrown around in American politics. But the idea being is that we exist in communities, and there has to be this solidarity, because we need the communities to thrive. We need to be the communities to be healthy and thriving 100 years from now. We need to have people who can afford to purchase, right, all the products that are being created by all these companies. It is really, really important that there are enough resources around in order to be able to support the communities. And so I think that, if there were a sort of an idea that I would put towards this regenerative politics, it is around this notion of, social solidarity, right? That the system needs to be arranged in a way that there are the resources to be able to fund the activities, right, that will result in the land, right, being productive and healthy, and the animals that and birds and insects that support the land and are dependent upon the land are supportive and healthy, and the people in the communities that depend on the land are healthy in 100 years from now. And so that's where I think we need to go with regenerative. But my fear is that the word regenerative, because of the way it's currently being used, has already been co-opted. Right, that when people think about regenerative agriculture, are they going to be able to go, okay, we need to go to regenerative economics and regenerative politics, right? I don't know the answer. I personally think that there's already been enough co-opting of it. We have, again, multiple certification programs. There are different definitions. They seem to have similar focuses, but they're not identical focuses. And so it's really, really important to understand that. And so what I want to suggest is that rather than using regenerative or agroforestry, and by the way, when we talk about agroforestry, there's another program which is called agropequaria, which is when you incorporate livestock into the mix. So, for example, if I had a cacao farm, might I have other animals like pigs and chickens, which are a deliberate part of the mix, so that there is a diversity of crops, but also there are ways to keep down pests and to deal with trash and waste on the farm, right? I mean, personally, I would love to find a cacao farm with a pig farmer on the farm or next to it, in which, like a one of those really expensive Iberico hams, instead of finishing them off on acorns, we're finishing the pigs off on cacao, right? What would that do to the flavor of? I mean, if you're not a vegan or a vegetarian, I understand, but what would that be? What kinds of things lend themselves, all right, to expanding the range of economic opportunities? And this is where I think the notion of expanding regenerative to what the term that I use, which is restorative. So restorative agriculture is about restoring the balance to the land, right? To getting it back to the way it was, right, in a pre-agricultural context, and then to be able to ensure that we're maintaining that the ability of the land to support the kind of agriculture that we need in order to be able to feed us, right? So I like the idea of restorative rather than regenerative, right? And then that has a parallel in terms of restorative economics, right? And when you think about it, we want to get back to an economic system, right, which does not, which supports the notion of social solidarity, right? That what we're doing is we're ensuring that the people are who rely on the agriculture, and we all rely on agriculture. And here in the United States, there's roughly 3%, 4% of the population is engaged in agricultural activities for 330, 350 million people. If you go to Nigeria, 220 million people, like 70%. So 140 million people are involved in the agricultural sector. So it's important to understand, how this all works, and what the goals are. And then I think it's also really, really important to understand that if we're thinking about restorative agriculture and restorative economics, this needs to be supported, right? So restorative agriculture needs to be supported by a restorative economic system. And in order to get to a restorative economic system, we need to get to a restorative political system, right? Do you agree right? Do you disagree? For me, these are, concepts which I work with in my head a lot. I bounce them off of people. I'm interested in, knowing what you all think about these ideas. Whether I showed you these pictures, right? And whether or not you thought, wow, how can that possibly be a representation of regenerative agriculture? How could this photo possibly be a representation of regenerative agriculture? Right. So hopefully, in that respect, I've expanded your minds and expanded your horizons and changed the way you're thinking about it. And again, this represents a special case because the people who are doing this have the financial resources to do this. Right. And they are stakeholders. They're not smallholder farmers, but they are hiring labor at wages which are above the local um, market rate, and they're providing additional services in terms of access to education, access to medical services that might not be available to a smallholder farmer. So we need to look at this holistically. We need to look at it in a restorative way. These farmers exist within communities, right? It's not just the farm, right? It's the communities that these farmers live in, which I think is really, really important to consider. And with that, we're at the end of the hour. I want to thank everybody who's watched from the beginning to the end. You can still throw comments into this. This episode of Pod Safe Chocolate, as every episode of Pod Safe Chocolate is supported by the members of the Chocolate Life. I'm currently logged in, so my button says account. If you go to the Chocolate Life, you're not a member, you're not logged in, it will say join. Click on join. There's always a free membership. You're watching on YouTube, like this video. Subscribe to the channel, hit the subscribe button so that you'll get notifications of future episodes. And with that, what I want to do is I want to say, so there is an archive and calendar post, and every single episode of Pod Safe Chocolate that I've done, there is a link to the post for every single one of these episodes. So you can look through here and you can find out when the episode happened and what the topics are, and you can click on it and you can go to that page. There's also a list of episodes which are scheduled for the future. And I want to point out that this coming Tuesday, I'm going to be exploring chocolate and cocoa on the interweb. Some of the tools that I use as a researcher, as an author, to be able to find the information that I'm looking for, including a really cool new one that I found, which is associated with maps, which I think is a lot of fun. And then a week, so that's this coming Tuesday. Next Friday, so a week from today, I'm going to be having a conversation with a Volker Lehmann. Volker Lehmann, I've known of Volker since about 2006. I don't remember exactly when I met him, but I went to Bolivia in 2010 twice, had a chance to spend a lot of time with him. He is the owner of the Hacienda Tranquilidad, and he is the person who brought the wild cacao silvestre, to Falkland in the mid-2000s, and is the recipient of the first ever heirloom cacao preservation designation, so it's HCP 001. He's currently in Amsterdam. He's going to be back in Santa Cruz de la Sierra in next Friday, and we're going to be having the conversation with him from Bolivia. And we're going to be talking about Bolivian cacao, the evolution of the Hacienda Tranquilidad over the course of the last decade, and lots of other topics next Friday. So you can go and you can visit this post, whether you're a member or not, right? It's there, and you can go and figure out what the future of Pod Safe Chocolate looks like. So you can keep yourself notified, and then if you want to, you can go back and review previous episodes. Before I leave, I just also want to talk about this. So this is a group, Salones Internacionales de Cacao y Chocolate, which is a group that I manage on Facebook. So if you're a member of Facebook, you can join it. It's free to join. I do moderate the sign-up process to this group. There's been a huge issue associated with spam and other posts, so I do take care of it. But this group originally started in 2013. I created it for people who had gone to the Salón del Cacao y Chocolate in Lima, right, and wanted to continue to communicate over the course of the year. There was a way to stay in touch, right, after we all met in Lima. And I managed it for a bunch of years, and it was called, Salons, it was in English, right? And then I changed the title of the group, the name of the group, to Spanish, Salones Internacionales de Cacao y Chocolate, and rather than the International Chocolate Salon in Lima, it was International Chocolate Salons Anywhere. And it's not obvious here, but what you can do is you'll find out that we're just shy of the 10,000 member level. So we're 9,900 plus members. The group here is diverse. Most of the members are in Latin America. A lot of the posts are in Spanish, but there are members who are around the world. And so there's regular postings from chocolate makers. We have postings about news. We have postings about classes and equipment. There are just a lot of stuff in here. And once you are a member and once you've been approved, you can go and post your own. You can promote your own classes. You can promote your own work. You can communicate with others. There are a couple of chats that are in the group, but I would really like to get this group up to 10,000 in the near future. So if you're not already a member, go check out this. I'll put a link to this in today's post, and so you can get there very, very easily. And with that, again, I want to thank everybody for joining me here today. To say to everybody, have a great weekend. I'll be back this coming Tuesday, where we'll be talking about tools to research cocoa and chocolate on the webs, the places that I go to find information and inspiration for the work that I do. And then a week from today, I'm really looking forward to the conversation with Volker Lehmann. We got a couple of really, really fun things to be discussing, including some travel opportunities, right? Which I think if you have never been to that part of the world, you might want to put into your thinking cap and go, ooh, might this travel make sense for me, as a learning experience? And with that, again, I want to close out by saying, if you're working with chocolate and you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. I hope everybody knows from the way I approach these things that after 20 some odd years, I'm still having fun. And because I'm still having fun, a lot of it is because of you. A lot of it is because the members of the Chocolate Life, the people who watch Pod Safe Chocolate, I'm still having a lot of fun. And I hope you are too. And with that, cheers, everybody.